Have you ever watched a country stare down a $20 billion punishment 2 days from landing and calmly say no? Because that is exactly what Canada did this week. And the one move it used to escape the trap is already changing how the most important border in the world works. So before we get into what Canada did and why it matters to you, I have one small favor to ask. If you like stories that make complicated things feel simple, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who could use a good explanation today. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps more than you know. Now let's break this down. Here's where we are right now. On August 25th, the United States is scheduled to hit roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods with a 50% tariff. This is not a rumor. It's not a worst-case projection from some analyst with an axe to grind. It's a date written into an executive order that was signed last month, and that date is 2 days away. The tariff doesn't aim at one industry. It reaches across 554 separate categories of products: dairy, cement, honey, hockey sticks, plywood, down feathers, wine, beer. Whatever you picture moving across that border in a truck, a train, or a cargo ship, chances are it's on the list somewhere. And here's the number that should actually stop you. Some officials tracking these talks say that once every single category is fully counted, that 20 billion could stretch toward 28. To put that in perspective, the United States imported roughly $382 billion worth of goods from Canada last year alone. So this one deadline threatens to tax somewhere between 5 and 7% of that entire relationship overnight in one legal action on one date. You might be thinking that this is just another round in a long fight, and Canada will push back, both sides will posture, and something will get signed at the last minute. That's the script everyone got used to. This time, the script broke. 2 days ago, Canadian negotiators met with American officials, looked at Washington's latest offer, and walked away without a deal. Not a soft, maybe. Not a request for more time. No. According to 2 separate sources briefed on the talks, Canada is not satisfied with what the Americans put on the table, and it is not willing to sign it, with the clock at 2 days and counting. To understand why that refusal matters, you need to understand how this specific trap was built. So let's rewind. Back in July, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations, and each one was aimed at a different Canadian policy he doesn't like. One targets the provincial boycotts that pulled American alcohol off Canadian shelves. One targets Canada's retaliatory tariffs on American-made vehicles. One targets how Canada divides up its dairy quotas under the existing trade deal. 3 grievances, 3 separate legal triggers, all converging on the same date. And all of it runs on a piece of American trade law from 1930, Section 338 of the Tariff Act, a law so old it has almost never been used in modern trade history. Washington essentially reached into the archives, dusted off a law from nearly a century ago, and aimed it at a neighbor it has traded with peacefully for generations. And here's what makes this deadline much worse than it sounds on paper. These new tariffs don't replace the ones Canada is already paying. They stack directly on top of them. Steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber are already sitting under separate American tariffs that have been in place for months. Now add 50% on top of that. Run the numbers, and some Canadian goods end up with an effective tax rate higher than anything either country has seen in decades. Products that used to cross this border completely duty-free are now staring at a wall of stacked penalties. And this didn't happen in isolation. This deadline is simply the newest layer on a pile that's been growing for 18 months. Steel used in food and beverage packaging got temporary relief only until the end of January. Aluminum used in similar products got a reprieve only until the end of June. Softwood lumber has been carrying its own 10% tariff since last October. Upholstered furniture, kitchen cabinets, and vanities climbed as high as 50% by the start of this year. Each one was announced at the time as a narrow, targeted measure. Stacked together, they stop looking like a series of isolated disputes and start looking like a campaign. One sector at a time, working its way through nearly every corner of Canadian manufacturing and agriculture. Take the auto sector alone. It supports hundreds of thousands of jobs in Ontario, and a single vehicle can cross this border 6 times before it ever rolls off the line. A truck that ends up in a dealership in Ohio pulls steel from one country, aluminum from another, and parts assembled in Toronto before it's even finished. When you layer a tax on every one of those crossings, you're not taxing Canada, you're taxing the manufacturing system itself, and the jobs on both sides that depend on it moving smoothly. So now you can see the box. Say yes to a weak offer and you tell Washington that this tactic works, and every future deadline gets easier for them. Say no and $20 billion in tariffs land in 2 days, right on top of everything already stacked. Either way, Canada loses something real. That's the trap. And this border isn't just a line on a map. It's the longest undefended border in the world, and it carries roughly $2 billion in goods across it every single day. Canada buys more from the United States than China does. And the United States buys more from Canada than from any other single country on the planet. These two economies aren't just neighbors, they're welded together at the factory floor, which is exactly why a fight aimed this deep into a shared system was always going to be harder to walk away from than it looks in a press release. Except this week, Canada didn't pick either option. It picked a third path. And to understand that path, you have to understand something about how these two countries normally negotiate. Here's the pattern that defined this relationship for the better part of a year. Washington sets a deadline. Washington threatens a big, headline-grabbing tariff number. And more often than not, Ottawa eventually adjusts, makes a concession, and the deadline quietly gets pushed or resolved on terms closer to what Washington wanted in the first place. It happened so many times that people started treating it like gravity. You don't argue with it, you just account for it. Both governments did, so did the reporters covering them. This week, for the first time in a while, gravity stopped working. Canada looked at the offer, checked the calendar, and said no with 2 days left. That's not a small thing, that's a signal that the balance of fear has shifted. And to see how, you need to look at what's actually sitting on the table right now. Because this isn't a simple yes or no negotiation. It's a trade, a swap. Canada has put together a substantial package of its own concessions. It would remove its retaliatory tariffs on American-made vehicles. It would end the provincial bans that pulled American wine, beer, and spirits off store shelves. It would ease procurement rules that currently favor Canadian suppliers. And it would accept Washington's interpretation of how dairy quotas get divided under the existing trade deal. 4 real concessions, each one politically expensive inside Canada. In exchange, Canada wants Washington to meaningfully cut its Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, the ones that have been hammering Canadian industry for over a year, and to open the door to relief on autos and softwood lumber as well. According to people close to the talks, the two sides have exchanged detailed written proposals. This isn't posturing anymore. It's written language in real documents, sitting in front of real negotiators on both sides of the border. The pace tells you how serious it is. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief negotiator Janice Charette have been flying to Washington so often it's become routine. They've met with the United States trade representative 3 times in 3 weeks, and they were back at the table. Again this week for a second meeting within days. That's the rhythm of people who believe a deal is possible. But the American offer, according to people familiar with the discussions, lowers some of the existing sectoral tariffs. Nowhere near as much as Canada is asking for. In other words, Washington offered a small amount of give, packaged to look like a lot. And Canada didn't take it. Here's where the story starts to get interesting. Almost nobody outside those rooms fully understands how deep Canada's lines actually go. The public story is that Canada is haggling over percentages. The real story is that Canada is protecting something it has already decided is not up for discussion. Supply management, the system that protects Canadian dairy, egg, and poultry farmers. It stays exactly where it is. What's actually being negotiated is not the system itself. It's a narrower dispute over quota allocation rules that were originally negotiated back in 2018, before the current trade agreement was even signed. That distinction matters enormously because dairy farmers across Quebec and Ontario have made it unmistakably clear to the federal government that trading away supply management to make this problem disappear is not something they will accept quietly. So Ottawa is threading a needle. Give ground on quota mechanics, protect the core system entirely, and hope that's enough to satisfy Washington without igniting a political firestorm at home. And that's only the federal half of the story. The provincial half is where this stops being abstract and starts showing up in real stores. Here's a detail most coverage misses entirely. Even if Ottawa signs a deal tomorrow, parts of it simply cannot be enforced. Alcohol sales in Canada are provincial business, not federal business. That means even Prime Minister Mark Carney does not have the constitutional authority to force a single province to put American liquor back on its shelves. Only 2 provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, have actually lifted their bans so far. The rest haven't budged. And some are refusing outright. Ontario's Premier and British Columbia's Premier have both said publicly that they will not restock American alcohol even if Ottawa signs a federal deal. That technically calls for it. Ontario's liquor board pulled every bottle of American wine, beer, and spirits off its shelves back when this fight started. Nova Scotia did the same and doubled highway tolls on American commercial trucks for good measure. The Northwest Territories stopped its liquor commission from buying American products altogether. Ontario went even further and canceled a $100 million contract with Elon Musk's Starlink. None of that reverses just because 2 governments shake hands in a conference room. And the stakes behind those store shelves are bigger than politics. Before this dispute started, Canada was the single largest export market in the world for American wine, and the second largest for American spirits. Distillers and vineyards across the United States built that customer base over decades. It didn't pause, it vanished. And winning it back may take just as long. Deal or no deal? So here's the honest question this deadline forces on all of us. What happens when your grocery bill becomes a bargaining chip in someone else's negotiation? Because that's not a distant hypothetical anymore. That's the next 48 hours. If you want to understand the forces deciding what food costs, what cars cost, and what your country can and can't control at its own border, this channel goes deep on exactly those stories. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay till the end. Because the ending of this one is genuinely not what most people expect. So if Canada is under this much pressure on this tight a clock, why is it still saying no? This is the part of the story that flips everything. And it starts with a single number that Mark Carney has been repeating in public for weeks. American aluminum prices are up 52% since the 50% tariff on imported metal went into effect. 52% in 1 year. Carney made that point standing outside a Rio Tinto aluminum plant in Quebec. The province, that alone, supplied 65% of all the aluminum the United States imported in 2024. And his argument was simple, and honestly kind of devastating. That 52% increase is not landing on Canadian producers. It's landing on American manufacturers, American car makers, American construction firms. All of them now pay significantly more for a metal their own country still can't produce enough of on its own. Carney called it a win-win opportunity, meaning there's a deal here where both countries benefit from lowering the tariff, because right now, one side is quietly bleeding out. And it isn't the side Washington meant to punish. Think about what that means in practice. Ford builds its best-selling F-150 using Canadian materials that cross this border constantly. When tariffs push up the price of the aluminum and steel going into that truck, who pays? American consumers, for an American-made vehicle, built by an American company, in American factories, employing American workers. That's not a Canadian problem showing up on a Canadian receipt. That's a domestic cost hitting a domestic company because of a policy aimed at a foreign neighbor. And that's the one move, the strategy the whole week depends on. It's not a counter tariff. It's not a dramatic threat. It's simpler than that, and much harder to answer. Canada made the punishment hurt the punisher. It built the leverage quietly over a full year, piece by piece, aluminum contract by aluminum contract, provincial boycott by provincial boycott, so that when the deadline finally arrived, the cost of following through would land on the other side of the table. That's why Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has said publicly that he's counting on senators, governors, and business leaders inside the United States itself to start applying pressure on the administration from within. Because the math on this dispute doesn't actually favor Washington the way the headline numbers suggest. LeBlanc has pointed to companies like Ford as exactly the kind of pressure he's betting on. Businesses that depend so heavily on Canadian materials that they have every incentive to lobby their own government for relief, no matter which side of the border they're headquartered on. He's also said this negotiation hasn't hit a dead end, even after an earlier deadline, agreed to personally between Carney and Trump, came and went last year with nothing signed. That's not a small detail. It tells you both leaders have already been through at least one full cycle of setting a deadline, watching it pass, without resolution, and simply continuing to negotiate anyway. That's exactly the kind of precedent that gives Ottawa room to walk away from an unsatisfying offer this week without treating it as a crisis. They've been here before, and the relationship survived. Here's the timeline most people never see. Back in the summer of 2025, Carney and Trump personally agreed to reach a deal within 30 days. That deadline came and went with no agreement at all. No collapse, no catastrophe. Just a quiet continuation of the same conversation. And underneath that entire cycle sits an even bigger clock that almost nobody's watching. The broader continental trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico is already up for its scheduled review this year. A checkpoint built into the deal. Checkpoint built into the deal itself, forcing all three countries to decide whether to extend the framework as it stands or reopen it entirely. This specific August deadline, as urgent as it feels, is really just one skirmish inside that much larger negotiation, which means whatever gets decided in the next 2 days is unlikely to be the final word on any of this, no matter which way it breaks. None of that means Canada is walking away from this fight without real costs of its own. And it's worth being honest about those, because this is not a story where one side wins everything and the other loses everything. The Bank of Canada is projecting that the country's economy will finish this year roughly 1.5% smaller than it would have been without any of this tariff pressure. That's real. That's jobs. That's investment decisions being delayed or canceled outright. The Canadian Steel Producers Association says domestic steel production has already dropped by roughly 30% since the original metals tariffs first landed. And there's a quieter number that tells a bigger story about confidence. The gap between how much capital Canadian investors are sending abroad versus how much foreign capital is coming into Canada has widened from just over $100 billion in 2014 to more than $828 billion today. That's not a headline, that's money. Quietly voting with its feet year after year, long before any of us started watching this countdown. And then there's the cost you can see in every neighborhood. Cement, lumber, and construction materials sound like abstract categories until you remember what they actually build. Every new home, every road, every bridge on either side of this border carries the price of these tariffs inside it. At a moment when housing affordability is already one of the defining economic pressures in both countries, taxing the materials that create shelter is a choice with consequences that land in the most ordinary places possible. There's also a warning buried in all of this that's worth taking seriously. It comes from David McNaughton, Canada's former ambassador to the United States, someone who has sat across the table from American trade officials before. He said publicly that while Canada has put together a genuinely substantial package, he doubts the American side is actually ready to sign anything close to a comprehensive deal right now. Or more specifically, he doubts President Trump himself is. His warning to Ottawa has been blunt. Don't hand over piecemeal concessions and hope for the best, because that leaves Canada exposed to yet another round of tariff threats down the road, without ever securing the durable relief it actually needs. And he's pointed to something structural that most coverage misses entirely. The United States Trade Representative may simply not have the authority to close a deal of this size on his own. A lasting resolution, in McNaughton's view, almost certainly requires a direct conversation between Carney and Trump themselves. Not just officials shuttling proposals back and forth in conference rooms. He knows what that looks like, because he's lived it. When a deal has to survive political review in both capitals, the people who actually make the final call are the two leaders at the top. Nothing else can close the gap. There's a pattern worth naming here, because it isn't unique to this dispute. Deadlines like this one, tied to a specific date and an enormous headline tariff number, tend to follow a predictable arc. Negotiations drag for months with little visible progress. Pressure builds sharply in the final days. And more often than not, the outcome is a partial arrangement, a side letter, or a narrow sector-specific fix, rather than the sweeping, comprehensive deal either side originally claimed to want. So here's where I want to bring you in, because this story lands differently depending on who's watching. If you're in Canada, this is about your shopping cart and your hometown mill. If you're in the United States, this is about your truck payment and your state's farms. And if you're anywhere else, this is a masterclass in how smaller countries hold their ground next to bigger ones. That mix is exactly why I love this community. People from everywhere, arguing with evidence, staying curious. If that sounds like you, subscribe and hit the bell, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Markets and analysts who have watched this relationship for years have started treating these deadlines the same way, discounting the odds of a full-blown tariff landing exactly as scheduled, right up until the very last days, which is precisely the window we're in right now. That doesn't mean this deadline is fake or that nothing will happen on August 25th if talks stall. It means the most likely outcomes sit somewhere between total collapse and total resolution, in the messier middle ground of partial relief, temporary extensions, or narrow side agreements that let both governments claim a version of victory without either side fully backing down. So let's walk through what each direction actually looks like, because it changes what happens to you depending on which one plays out. If a comprehensive deal gets signed first, expect an immediate reduction in steel and aluminum tariffs, a quiet lifting of Canada's retaliatory measures on American vehicles, and a slow, province-by-province rollback of alcohol restrictions that could take months rather than days, precisely because Ottawa can't force that part alone. If talks produce a narrow side arrangement, expect specific sectors like autos or aluminum to get relief, while dairy, alcohol, and the broader structure stay unresolved and get pushed into the Continental Review already underway this year. And if nothing gets signed at all, expect the full 50% to land on schedule, layered directly on top of the steel, aluminum, auto, and lumber tariffs already in place, with retaliatory measures from Ottawa almost certainly following within days. Given how clearly Carney has said Canada has options and simply hasn't chosen to use them yet, the honest answer is that even the people inside those rooms don't know which of these three futures is coming. Trump himself said a year ago that Canada could simply end up being a country where there just is a tariff, not a negotiation at all. That threat is still alive. And 2 days is a short runway to close the distance between where these two sides stand. But here's what we do know. The old assumption that ran this relationship for decades, Washington sets the terms and Canada eventually adjusts, has already cracked. You can see it in the aluminum price sheets. You can see it in the premiers refusing to restock American shelves. You can see it in a Prime Minister who keeps repeating the same sentence like a promise. Canada will not accept a bad deal, not a threat, not a slogan for a press conference, a boundary. He has held it through missed deadlines, through blown-up agreements, through months of tariffs that were technically supposed to be resolved by now, and the people across the table have started to believe him. Before I let you go, one last ask, and it's a different kind. This channel is built on stories that help people see the world clearly. No noise, no panic. Just the real mechanics underneath the headlines. If that's been worth something to you, the single most helpful thing you can do is share this video with one person who thinks trade is boring. Because it isn't. It's the quiet force deciding. What your neighbor's job pays and what your kid's lunch costs, one share. That's it. Thank you for being here. And zoom out for a second, because this isn't just a story about two countries. It's a story about how leverage actually works in the modern world. Smaller economies traditionally win by being agreeable. They keep their heads down, make concessions quietly, and hope the bigger partner never turns its full attention on them. Canada's bet. This year is the opposite. Instead of being agreeable, it made itself expensive to attack. Not loud, not reckless, just structurally painful to fight. And that's a lesson every smaller economy on Earth is watching right now, because if it works here, it will be copied everywhere. And now, the ending. Think about what August 25 represents. Not in dollars, but in meaning. For a century, these two neighbors settled their arguments the same way. One side pushed, the other eventually bent. And the border stayed open because both countries quietly understood that their relationship was worth more than any single fight. What's happening this week is the first time in a long time that one of them has looked at the other and said, "We're not going to bend, not out of spite." Because bending without a real answer would only guarantee that the next deadline gets worse. And inside that refusal, calm, deliberate, with 2 days on the clock, something fundamental shifted. Maybe a deal gets signed and this becomes a footnote. Maybe the tariffs land and both sides spend the next year counting the damage. Either way, the pattern is broken. The neighbor who used to fold is standing its ground. And the country that used to dictate terms is finding out that its own businesses are starting to ask why. And a friendship that will never run on the old rules again. The next 48 hours will tell you which world you're waking into. The one where nations talk, or the one where they bleed. Stay close, because whatever happens at that deadline, you just watched history turn a corner. And it was quieter than anyone expected.